I remember the taste of rust and ozone the moment they came for me, metallic and sharp on my tongue like I'd bitten through copper wire. The memory sits in my mouth even now, wherever now is, whatever I've become. They say, you forget the before times, once the black ships take you, that the mind mercifully scours itself clean of the life you had, but that's a lie told by those who've never felt the psychic hoods descend over their skulls, never felt their consciousness stretched and examined like flesh on a mortician's table. I remember everything, every moment, every face, every scream. I wish the Emperor's mercy extended to forgetting, but there is no mercy in the Imperium, only necessity, and I was necessary. My name was Kale, though I suspect that designation has been struck from every record in the hive where I was born. I was 16 when the witch mark showed itself, when I made the corpse starch rations multiply in my hands during the food riots on the 43rd level. I hadn't meant to do it, hadn't understood what was happening when the hunger gnawed so deep in my belly that I thought I might die, when I pressed my palms against the empty container and felt something inside me tear open like fabric ripping along an old seam. The starch appeared, materialized from nothing, enough to feed myself and my sister for a week. I should have let us starve. The joy on her face when I showed her, the way she hugged me and called me her hero, that memory cuts deeper than any blade the Imperium has since turned against my flesh. Someone saw. Someone always sees in the hives, in those towering cities of 100 billion souls pressed together like insects in a corpse, where privacy is a luxury reserved for those wealthy enough to afford sealed chambers and servitor guards. A neighbor, perhaps, or one of the ecclesiarchy watchers who walk the lower levels searching for signs of deviancy and mutation. Within 3 days, the Arbates came to our hab unit, their carapace armor black as obsidian in the flickering phosphor light, their shock mauls crackling with power. They didn't speak to me, didn't explain. One of them simply pointed, and the others moved forward with the mechanical precision of men who've done this 10,000 times before. My sister screamed. My mother, I remember, she didn't scream, didn't cry out, just stood there with her face empty as a servitor's, her eyes gone flat and distant like she'd already forgotten she had a son. Maybe it was easier that way. Maybe she'd trained herself long ago to sever emotional attachments quickly, cleanly, because in the hive you lose everyone eventually to the manufactorums or the gangs or the recycling vats. They bound my wrists with plasteel manacles that bit into the skin, drawing blood that dripped down my fingers and onto the corroded metal floor of our home. I tried to speak, tried to ask them what I'd done wrong, but one of the Arbites struck me across the mouth with the back of his gauntlet, and I tasted blood joining the rust and ozone flavor that had been there since the moment I'd used my power. That taste has never left. It's been years? Decades? Time loses meaning in the places they've taken me, in the spaces between spaces where they test us and break us and remake us into whatever tools the Imperium requires. But that taste remains, a constant reminder of the moment my life ended and my service began. They took me down through the hive levels, deeper than I'd ever been, past the manufactorums where I'd hoped to work one day, past the corpse processing plants where the dead are rendered into sustenance for the living, past the recycling centers where even waste has value in the Emperor's domain. We descended for what felt like hours, the air growing thicker and hotter with each level, until we reached the deep docks where the bulk haulers connect to the hive's underbelly, like metal parasites feeding on their host. That's where I saw it for the first time, through the grime-encrusted viewports of the holding pen, where they'd caged me with 24 others. The black ship. It hung in the void beyond the docks like a cathedral carved from midnight, its hull absorbing light rather than reflecting it, making it seem less like a physical object and more like a wound torn in reality itself. Kilometers long, bristling with sensor arrays and weapon batteries and Gothic architecture that made no sense for a vessel meant to travel. The stars flying buttresses and gargoyles and towering spires, topped with Aquila symbols large enough to crush buildings. I couldn't look away from it. None of us could. We pressed against the viewport, like moths drawn to a flame that would incinerate us, and we stared at the ship that would carry us away from everything we'd ever known, toward a fate we didn't understand, but knew in our bones would be worse than death. The others in the holding pen were all young, all my age or near enough. Some were crying, sobbing into their hands with snot running down their faces and their bodies shaking with terror. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing, their minds already broken by whatever they'd seen or done to reveal their witch taint. One girl, couldn't have been more than 14, kept trying to scratch through her own wrists with her fingernails, digging at the flesh around her manacles, until the guards noticed and sedated her with an injector gun that hissed as it delivered its payload through her jumpsuit. She slumped immediately, her eyes rolling back to show the whites, and they dragged her away to whatever section of the pen held those too disturbed to remain with the general population. I wanted to be brave. I wanted to face this with the stoic dignity that the ecclesiarchy preachers always talked about in their sermons, the noble acceptance of the emperor's will that marked a true servant of the Imperium. But I was 16 and terrified, and I'd never been away from my hive level before this day, never been further than 10 kilometers from the Hab unit where I was born. So I sat in the corner, and I shook, and I tried not to think about my sister's face, tried not to wonder who would take care of her now that I was gone, tried not to imagine her starving in the next food shortage, or being taken by the gangs, or falling into one of the countless other dark fates that consume children in the hive's lower levels. The guards came for us after what might have been hours or days. They'd taken my chronometer, and the holding pen had no windows except the one showing the black ship, nothing to mark the passage of time, except the regular delivery of nutrient paste that tasted like lubricant oil mixed with synthetic proteins. They lined us up single file and bound us together with a chain that ran through the loops in our manacles, turning us into a human train that shuffled forward at the pace of the slowest among us. I was somewhere in the middle, close enough to see the embarkation ramp ahead, far enough back that I could still imagine turning around and running, though of course there was nowhere to run to, no escape from the guards with their shock mauls and automatic weapons. The ramp led from the docks into the ship's belly through an airlock large enough to swallow our entire group with room to spare. As we crossed the threshold, I felt something change in the air, felt a pressure against my skin like invisible hands pressing from all directions at once. The ship had its own atmosphere, its own gravity, and both felt subtly wrong, subtly different from the hive's environment, in ways I couldn't articulate, but that made my stomach clench and my head ache. Later I would learn that black ships are warded, their hulls inscribed with protective runes and holy seals, meant to contain the psychic emanations of their cargo, meant to prevent us from using our powers or calling out with our minds to the things in the warp that hunger for souls like ours. Those wards pressed against my consciousness like thumbs against my temples, a constant low-level discomfort that never entirely faded. They processed us in a chamber that reminded me of the corpse-rendering plants I'd passed on the way down through the hive, the same industrial efficiency, the same sense of human beings as raw material to be sorted and categorized and sent along to their appropriate destinations. Servitors with dead eyes and mechanical limbs moved among us, scanning us with handheld devices that clicked and hummed and emitted faint green light. The data they collected was transmitted to tech priests who stood at cogitator banks along the chamber's walls, their augmented fingers clicking across keyboards too fast for unmodified humans to track. I saw one of the priests look at his screen after my scan completed, saw his mechadendrites twitch in what might have been surprise or concern, and then he marked something on his display and moved on to the next readout without acknowledging my existence. A woman in the black robes and high collar of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica moved down our line after the scanning was complete, stopping before each of us in turn to study us with eyes that seemed to look through flesh and bone to examine whatever lay beneath. When she reached me, she paused for a long moment, her head tilted slightly to one side like a bird examining an interesting insect. Her eyes were silver, I noticed, completely silver, with no visible iris or pupil, and when she looked at me, I felt that pressure in my head increase until I thought my skull might crack from the inside out. She murmured something to one of the tech priests, who made a notation on his data slate, and then she moved on, leaving me with the sense that I'd been judged and found wanting in some fundamental way. They separated us after that, sorting us into groups based on criteria they never explained. Some were taken to the left, others to the right, a few to a third corridor that led deeper into the ship's interior. I went with the largest group, the ones led to the right, and we shuffled through passages lined with pipes and cables and Gothic architecture that seemed designed more to inspire dread than to serve any practical function. The walls were inscribed with high Gothic scripture, words I couldn't read but that seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision, and everywhere hung the Aquila, the Emperor's eagle, its twin heads staring down at us with bronze eyes that caught the flickering lumens and seemed to follow our movement. Our destination was a holding chamber 10 levels below the embarkation deck, a vast space filled with containment cells arranged in neat rows like burial chambers in a catacomb. Each cell was barely large enough for one person to lie down in, with walls of reinforced plasteel and a small viewport in the door that allowed observation from outside, but gave the occupant no view of anything except the ceiling. They placed us one per cell, removing our manacles only after the doors had sealed, leaving us alone in the darkness with nothing but our thoughts and the constant thrumming vibration that marked the ship's warp engines powering up for transit. I don't know how long I spent in that cell. The darkness was absolute when they turned off the lumens, so complete that I couldn't see my hands when I held them inches from my face. I slept when exhaustion overcame me, woke when nightmares jerked me back to consciousness, and spent the hours between in a state of numb terror that gradually transformed into something else, something colder and more resigned. This was my life now. This was all my life would ever be. Whatever waited at the end of this journey, I would face it alone, forgotten by everyone I'd ever known, my name struck from the records, my existence reduced to a number in some vast ledger maintained by bureaucrats who'd never met me and never would. The ship entered the warp on what I guessed was the 3rd or 4th day of transit time was meaningless in the cell, but I'd developed a rough sense of cycles based on when they delivered nutrient paste and water. I felt the transition like a sickness in my bones, like the universe itself had turned inside out and dragged my body along with it. The vibration changed, became irregular, almost organic, as though the ship were breathing or digesting us. And then I heard the screaming. It came from the other cells, muffled by the plasteel walls but still audible, still clear enough that I could hear the raw agony in it. Some of my fellow prisoners were reacting to the warp, their untrained psychic senses overwhelmed by proximity to that realm of chaos and nightmare that exists behind the material universe. I pressed my hands over my ears and tried not to listen, tried not to imagine what they were experiencing, but the screaming went on, sometimes stopping for brief periods of exhausted silence before starting again with renewed horror. One voice, a boy who sounded younger than me, kept calling for his mother over and over until his throat went raw and the words became unintelligible, croaking. I didn't scream. The pressure in my head had become intense, had grown into a migraine so severe that I vomited the nutrient paste I'd consumed earlier and lay in the puddle of my own sick, too weak to move, too afraid to sleep in case I never woke up. But I didn't scream. I held the sound inside, swallowed it down, because screaming would have meant acknowledging the reality of what was happening, and I wasn't ready for that yet, wasn't ready to accept that this was real and permanent and inescapable. The warp transit lasted an eternity, compressed into what might have been days or weeks. The ship shuddered and groaned around us like a living thing in pain, and the screaming from the other cells continued with only brief respites when someone's voice gave out or they passed into unconsciousness. I learned to exist in a state of semi-awareness, my mind retreating into itself to escape the physical and psychic torment, though I never quite achieved full dissociation. Some part of me remained anchored in my body, feeling every spike of pain, hearing every scream, experiencing every moment of that transit through hell with terrible clarity. When we finally emerged back into real space, the sudden cessation of the warp's pressure was almost as traumatic as its onset. My ears popped, my sinuses cleared, and I could breathe again without feeling like I was drowning in invisible fluid. The screaming stopped, cut off so abruptly that the silence felt like another form of violence. I lay on the floor of my cell, too exhausted to move, staring at the ceiling and wondering if any of us had survived with our minds intact, or if we'd all been broken by the journey and simply hadn't realized it yet. They came for us, after what I later learned was a 6-hour acclimation period. Guards in the white and red livery of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, who opened our cells and dragged us out, regardless of whether we could stand on our own. Many couldn't. I saw children carried past my cell, their eyes rolled back in their heads, drool running from their slack mouths, their limbs twitching with seizures or hanging limp as corpses. Some were talking to themselves in languages that didn't exist, words that hurt to hear, syllables that shouldn't fit together but somehow did in configurations that made my brain ache. Those ones were separated from the group immediately, taken away down corridors marked with warning glyphs and biohazard symbols. I could walk, though barely, leaning against the wall for support as they herded us through the ship toward whatever came next. We'd arrived somewhere I didn't know where, wouldn't learn where for months yet, and we were being transferred from the black ship to some other facility. I caught glimpses through viewports as we moved through the embarkation decks, saw a world outside that looked like it had been carved from white stone, vast structures of marble and granite rising into a pale sky. Everything was white or grey or silver, cold colors that reflected light without warmth, and I felt a deep chill settle into my bones that had nothing to do with temperature. The facility they took us to was called the Scholastica Psychana, though I wouldn't learn its name until much later, when I'd survived long enough to be considered worthy of basic information about my situation. It was one of hundreds scattered across the Imperium, way stations where young psykers are brought to be tested, trained, or destroyed, depending on what the evaluation teams determine about their potential utility. The building was exactly what I'd glimpsed from the viewports, white marble and grey granite, Gothic architecture stretching toward the sky, like the fingers of a drowning man reaching for air. We entered through gates large enough to accommodate heavy vehicles, passed between statues of saints and heroes whose names I didn't know, and descended into the facility's interior, where the stone was cold enough to make our breath steam in the air. They stripped us first, took away the jumpsuits we'd worn since leaving our homes, left us naked and shivering in a processing chamber, while servitors hosed us down with water so cold it felt like needles against my skin. The water pressure was brutal, strong enough to knock some of the smaller children off their feet, and I had to brace myself against the wall to avoid being swept away by the torrent. They sprayed us with disinfectant that stung my eyes and burned in my nostrils, scrubbed us with brushes that left my skin raw and bleeding in places, and then left us to air dry in that freezing chamber while they burned our old clothes in an incinerator whose flames I could see through a viewport in the wall. New clothes came next. Simple grey robes made from rough fabric that chafed against my abraded skin. No undergarments, no shoes, nothing but the robe and a thin rope belt to hold it closed. They branded us then, used a servo arm to hold each of us in turn, while a tech priest pressed a hot iron against our left shoulders, marking us with a number and a glyph I didn't recognize. The pain was extraordinary, white-hot and all-consuming, and I did scream then, couldn't help myself, couldn't maintain the stoic silence I'd managed during the warp transit. The smell of my own burning flesh filled my nostrils, mixed with that ever-present taste of rust and ozone, and I vomited again, though my stomach was empty and I could only heave up bile and acid. I was 7743 Psi Tertius. That was my new designation, the identity that would follow me through whatever came next. They didn't use our names here, assuming we still remembered them, and from what I could see in the dead eyes of the servitors and the blank expressions of the guards, names were a luxury we'd surrendered when we boarded the black ships. We were numbers now, categories, potential resources to be evaluated and allocated according to the Imperium's needs. The training began immediately. Before we'd recovered from the processing, before we'd been fed or given time to sleep, they took us in groups of 10 to chamber rooms, lined with strange machinery, banks of cogitators connected to neural probes and psychic amplifiers that hummed with barely contained energy. Each of us was fitted with a helmet covered in sensors and electrodes, the metal cold against our freshly shaved heads. They'd removed all our hair during the cleaning process, another layer of identity stripped away, and then they activated the machines and the real pain began. I don't have adequate words for what happened in those chambers, for the sensation of having your mind pried open and examined like a specimen under a microscope. The machines could read our thoughts, measure our psychic potential, map the pathways our power used to manifest. But they weren't gentle, weren't careful about preserving what they examined. I felt myself being turned inside out, felt my consciousness stretched across dimensions I couldn't comprehend, felt memories being pulled from my mind and displayed on screens I couldn't see for technicians I couldn't hear. They took everything: my childhood, my sister's face, the texture of my mother's hands, the smell of corpstarch cooking, the sound of the hive's ventilation systems, and they recorded it all, quantified it all, reduced it all to data points in their endless analysis. Some of us broke during the initial testing. I heard their minds shatter, heard it on some level that had nothing to do with sound, felt the psychic backlash as their consciousness fragmented under the strain. The machines would emit a high-pitched whine, alarms would sound, and servitors would rush forward to disconnect the failed subject before they could damage the equipment. I saw them carry out 3 bodies from my group alone, children whose brains had hemorrhaged or whose hearts had stopped, their faces frozen in expressions of terminal horror. The technicians made notations on their data slates and moved on to the next subject without pause, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement that something human had just died screaming in their laboratory. I survived the testing. Survived all 6 initial sessions, each one worse than the last, each one digging deeper into my psyche and pulling out things I hadn't known were there. They found the core of my power, the thing inside me that had let me create matter from nothing, and they mapped its structure and catalogued its strength and determined that I was a theta-grade psyker with specialization in molecular manifestation. I didn't know what that meant, wouldn't understand for months, but I saw the way the technicians looked at each other when the results appeared on their screens, saw something that might have been satisfaction or vindication in their half-machine faces. After the testing came the first real training, and with it, the first real understanding of what my life would become. They took us to chambers deep in the facility's heart, rooms carved from black stone and inscribed with wards similar to those on the black ship, but more complex, more powerful. The air in these chambers felt dead, felt like it had been emptied of something essential, and I realized later that they were null zones, spaces where the warp couldn't easily intrude, where our powers couldn't function without enormous effort. Here they would teach us control, would teach us to manifest our abilities despite the wards, would forge us into weapons the Imperium could use. Our instructor was a man who might have been 40 or 400, His age impossible to determine because half his face was covered in scar tissue and his eyes had been replaced with augmetic implants that glowed a dull red in the chamber's dim light. He never told us his name, insisted we call him Preceptor, and when he spoke his voice was the sound of grinding metal, harsh and cold and utterly without compassion. He told us we were abominations, told us we were necessary abominations, but abominations nonetheless, told us that the Emperor in his wisdom had granted humanity the gift of the Psyker, but that we were also its curse, its burden, its constant source of danger. Our existence placed every human in the Imperium at risk of demonic incursion, warp contamination, reality collapse. We were weapons that might explode at any moment. And our training was about teaching us to be weapons that exploded only when pointed at the Emperor's enemies. The lessons were brutal. They would command us to manifest our powers to create objects from nothing, in my case while the wards pressed down on our minds with crushing force. The effort required was immense, like trying to run with weights chained to my limbs, like trying to breathe with hands wrapped around my throat. I would concentrate until blood ran from my nose, until my eyes felt like they might burst from their sockets, until the migraine became so severe that I vomited and lost consciousness. And then they would revive me, give me a few minutes to recover, and make me try again. Most of us failed initially. I watched a boy named something like 7751 Psi Tertius try to manifest a simple light globe for 6 hours straight, watched him push himself until he had a seizure and fell to the floor convulsing, foam running from his mouth and his spine arching until I thought it might snap. The preceptor watched impassively, made notes on his data slate, and when the seizure ended, he ordered the servitors to carry the boy to the medical wing. The boy never came back to our training sessions. I don't know if he died or if they found another use for him, but his absence was never explained, never acknowledged, and within days I had trouble remembering what he looked like. I learned eventually, learned to find the thin places in the wards, the microscopic gaps where my power could seep through, learned to use those gaps to manifest the things the instructors demanded, simple objects at first, geometric shapes made from basic materials, then more complex items, tools and components, and eventually organic matter. The process was agonizing every time, left me exhausted and bleeding and nauseated, but I learned because the alternative was failure, and failure meant disappearance, and disappearance meant death or worse, transformation into one of the shambling servitors that maintained the facility's infrastructure. The months blurred together into a haze of pain and training and indoctrination. Between the practical lessons they filled our heads with Imperial doctrine, made us memorize scripture and catechisms and prayers to the Emperor, taught us that we were his servants and his weapons, and that our only purpose was to defend humanity from the myriad horrors that pressed against it from all sides. They showed us pictures of daemons and xenos and heretics, showed us what happened to worlds that fell to chaos or were conquered by alien empires, showed us the stakes of our training, and made sure we understood that failure meant not just our own deaths, but potentially the deaths of billions. I believed it all. Had no choice but to believe it. Because what else was there? I'd seen the warp during our transit, had felt the wrongness in it, had heard the things that whispered at the edges of my consciousness during the long nights in my cell. I knew there were horrors in the universe that wanted to consume and corrupt and destroy everything human, everything sane. If my suffering could help prevent that, if my transformation into a weapon could save even one world from the fates we'd seen in those recordings, then perhaps my life had meaning beyond its own misery. They brought in a sanctioned psyker to talk to us one day, a woman who'd completed her training decades earlier and now served in some capacity I didn't fully understand. She looked ancient, her skin like parchment stretched over bone, her hair white and thin, her body bent and twisted by years of channeling power through her fragile human form. But her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and when she looked at us, I saw something I hadn't seen in any of the instructors or technicians. I saw recognition, saw memory of what it was like to sit where we sat, to face what we faced. She told us that only 1 in 10 psykers survived the initial training. The rest died or went mad or were deemed too dangerous and were destroyed. Of those who survived, only half would be sanctioned, granted the soul binding that would let them serve the Imperium in official capacities. The others would be given to different purposes. Some would become astropaths, their eyes burned out and replaced with the ability to send messages through the warp. Others would become sustenance for the Emperor himself, their souls fed to the Golden Throne to keep the Astronomicon burning so ships could navigate the warp. A handful would be transformed into other things, their bodies and minds reshaped to serve functions I didn't want to imagine. I looked around at my fellow trainees after she spoke, counted the 37 who remained from the 50 who'd started training in my cohort. We'd lost 13 already to the testing and the lessons. 13 children whose bodies had been carried away in the night, or who'd simply vanished between sessions. If her statistics were correct, only 3 or 4 of us would be sanctioned. The rest would die, or worse. I tried not to think about which category I'd fall into, tried not to calculate my odds, but the numbers haunted me in the dark hours, chasing me through nightmares where I was fed screaming to a golden throne, or had my eyes burned from my skull, while scribes tattooed wards into my skin. The training intensified as months became a year, became 2 years. They taught us to fight with our minds, to project force and fire and lightning, to create shields that could deflect projectiles and energy weapons. They taught us the proper prayers and rituals for safely accessing our powers, the wards and mental exercises that would protect us from the entities that prowled the warp looking for opportunities to possess unwary psykers. They taught us fear, drilled it into us until it became as instinctive as breathing, made sure we understood that overconfidence or pride or ambition were the fastest paths to demonic corruption. I remember the day they showed us what happens to psykers who fall to chaos. They took us to a containment chamber deep in the facility's lowest levels, a room wrapped in so many wards and protective seals that I could barely breathe under their combined weight. Inside was a cage, and inside the cage was something that might once have been human. It had too many limbs now, twisted at impossible angles, and its skin had split open to reveal muscle that writhed with its own volition, eyes that had grown in places eyes should never be. It was still conscious, still aware, and when it saw us, it began screaming in a voice that spoke in harmonics that shouldn't exist, words that wanted to take root in my mind and grow like infection. The preceptor made us watch for an hour, while the thing in the cage begged and threatened, and promised impossible pleasures and powers. He made us listen to its voice, let it scratch at the edges of our consciousness, let it tempt us with visions of freedom and strength, and then, when we were all shaking, and several of the weaker trainees had begun weeping, he drew a bolt pistol and shot the thing through what might have been its head, exploding it in a spray of fluids that shouldn't have existed in colors that hurt to perceive. "This is mercy," he said, his metal voice echoing in the chamber. "This is what I will do to any of you who show signs of corruption. Remember this. Remember that death is preferable to what the warp will make of you if you give it the slightest opening." I remembered. We all remembered. That night in my cell I dreamed of eyes growing in my palms and mouths opening in my chest. Dreamed of my thoughts being replaced by alien desires that wore my personality like a mask. I woke, screaming for the first time since entering the facility, brought guards who sedated me and dragged me to the medical wing where they kept me restrained for 3 days, monitoring my brain activity and checking for any signs of warp taint. They found nothing, declared it a simple nightmare brought on by stress and exhaustion, and sent me back to training with a notation in my file that would follow me forever. The sanctioning ceremony, when it finally came, was both relief and horror. 3 years I'd been in the facility, 3 years of training and testing, and watching others fail and disappear. Of the 50 who'd started, only 4 remained. Myself, a girl who could manipulate kinetic energy, a boy who demonstrated minor precognitive abilities, and another girl whose specialty I never learned because she died during the sanctioning process, her body unable to withstand the psychic trauma of the soul binding. They took us one at a time into a chamber that made all the other wards and null zones feel like gentle suggestions. This was a space where the warp had been pushed back through sheer force of will and technology, where reality was reinforced and strengthened until it felt solid as steel. At the chamber's center sat a figure I'd heard whispers of but never seen. A sanctioned psyker of immense power, ancient beyond measure, whose sole purpose was to perform the binding ritual that would mark us as loyal servants of the Imperium and give us the strength to resist demonic possession. I don't remember much of the actual ritual. Pain, yes, pain beyond anything I'd experienced during the training, pain that felt like my soul was being branded with hot iron, while my mind was flayed open and sewn back together with threads of psychic force. I remember screaming, remember seeing light that wasn't light, remember feeling something vast and terrible look at me through veils of reality and judge me worthy of continued existence, and then I was on the floor of the chamber, bleeding from my nose and ears and eyes, my body convulsing, guards carrying me out, while the preceptor made notations on his data slate with the same emotionless efficiency he'd shown during every other part of my training. I woke 3 days later in a recovery cell, my head wrapped in bandages and my body weak as an infant's. The girl who manipulated kinetic energy was in the cell next to mine, visible through a viewport in the wall. The boy with precognitive abilities was gone, disappeared during the ritual just like the other girl. 2 survivors from 50. The numbers the sanctioned Psyker had given us years earlier had been optimistic. They gave us new robes after we recovered. These ones marked with the symbols of sanctioned Psykers gave us data slates containing our new orders and designations. I was being transferred again, they informed me, sent to a facility where I would learn my specific duties in service to the Imperium. The girl would go somewhere else, learn different duties, serve in different capacities. We'd never see each other again, had barely spoken during our training, but in that moment I felt a profound connection to her, this other survivor, this other person who'd endured what I'd endured, and somehow remained whole enough to continue serving. The facility they sent me to was on another world, required another journey through the warp that left me sick and shaking despite the sanctioning that was supposed to protect me from its effects. This place was even colder than the Scholastica Psycana, built into the side of a mountain on a world where snow fell constantly and the sun was a dim blur behind perpetual clouds. Here I would learn my actual purpose, the specific function for which I'd been identified during those initial tests years ago. I was to be a manufacturer. My ability to create matter from nothing, to manifest objects through psychic will, made me valuable to the Imperium's war machine. I would spend my days in production chambers, using my power to create components for weapons and armor and vehicles, creating materials that were difficult or impossible to synthesize through conventional means. I would be a living factory, a tool for producing the materiel that kept the Imperium's armies equipped and functional. It was vital work, they assured me, essential to the Emperor's wars against humanity's enemies. Without psykers like me, many of the Imperium's most advanced technologies couldn't be produced in sufficient quantities. The work was grinding, monotonous, exhausting in ways the training had never been. They would place me in a production chamber with specifications for what needed to be created, and I would spend 8, 10, 12 hours manifesting object after object, component after component, until my nose bled and my hands shook and I could barely stand. The chambers had reduced wards compared to the training rooms, made it easier to access my power, but the sheer volume of production required was staggering. Thousands of components per day, each one needing to meet exact specifications or be discarded and remade. I was one of 50 psykers in the facility, all of us with similar abilities, all of us performing similar functions. We lived in cells barely large enough to lie down in, were fed nutrient paste and water, were given brief sleep cycles before being returned to the production chambers to work again. There was no conversation, no community, no sense of shared experience despite our proximity. The guards made sure we remained isolated, kept us separated except during production shifts, prevented any bonds from forming that might make us think of ourselves as people rather than tools. Years passed. I stopped counting after the first decade, stopped trying to maintain any sense of time or progress or personal history. I was 7743 Psi Tertius, manufacturer class psyker, assigned to production chamber 17 on a world whose name I'd never learned. That was all I was, all I would ever be. The boy named Kale, who'd lived in a hive and had a sister he loved, was gone, had died somewhere between the black ship and the sanctioning ceremony, had been erased as thoroughly as my name from the official records. I began to notice changes in my body as the decades accumulated. My hair, which had grown back after the initial processing, started falling out in patches. My skin took on a grayish pallor, became thin and papery like the old psyker who'd spoken to us during training. My hands developed tremors that worsened when I wasn't actively using my power, and I began needing progressively longer sleep cycles to recover from production shifts. The medical servitors who examined me quarterly noted these deteriorations in their reports, but offered no treatments, no interventions. I was burning out, they explained in their mechanical voices, the natural consequence of years of intensive psychic work. Most manufacturer-class psykers lasted 20 to 30 years before their bodies failed completely. I was approaching that threshold. I found I didn't care. The knowledge that I would die, that my body was consuming itself in service to the Imperium, felt neither frightening nor tragic. It simply was another fact, like the grey walls of my cell, or the taste of rust and ozone that had never left my mouth since that day in the hive. I would work until I couldn't work anymore, and then I would be disposed of, and another psyker would take my place in production chamber 17, and the great machine of the Imperium would continue grinding forward without pause. But something changed in my final year, something that disrupted the routine I'd settled into. They brought new psykers to the facility, young ones fresh from the Scholastica Psychana, their eyes still holding traces of personality and fear. I saw them during a transfer between chambers, saw their faces as guards led them past the production areas toward their assigned cells. One of them looked at me, met my eyes for just a moment, and I saw myself reflected there, saw the hollow shell I'd become, the walking corpse, still animated by nothing more than habit and duty. That night in my cell, for the first time in years, I thought about my sister, wondered if she was still alive, wondered if she'd survived the hive's countless dangers, wondered if she remembered having a brother who'd been taken away when she was young. She'd be in her 30s now if she'd survived. Probably had children of her own, probably told them stories about the food shortages and the gang violence and the endless grind of hive life. I hoped she didn't remember me, hoped I'd been forgotten cleanly and completely, because remembering would only cause her pain, and I'd caused enough pain just by existing. The tremors in my hands grew worse after that, made it difficult to maintain the precision required for component production. I began producing defective parts, items that didn't meet specifications and had to be discarded. The overseers noted the decline in their reports, increased my rest period slightly to see if that would improve performance, but the deterioration continued. I was failing, breaking down, approaching the end of my usefulness. They called me to an administrative chamber one day, a bare room with a single desk, where a tired-looking official in Departamento Munitorum robes sat reviewing files on a data slate. He looked up when I entered, studied me for a moment with the detached interest someone might show a piece of malfunctioning equipment, and then told me my production efficiency had fallen below acceptable thresholds. I was being reassigned, he said, transferred to a different facility for a different purpose. His tone was completely neutral, completely bureaucratic, and I understood that whatever came next, my time as a manufacturer was over. The transfer happened within days. Another black ship, another journey through the warp, though this one felt different somehow, felt heavier, more oppressive, as though the ship were descending rather than traveling. We emerged into orbit around a world that looked dead from space, its surface covered in vast structures that sprawled across continents, structures I recognized after a moment as processing facilities, places where the Imperium transformed raw materials into finished products. But these weren't ordinary manufactorums. The facility they took me to was built around a massive chamber at its heart, a space so vast I couldn't see the far walls, filled with machinery that hummed with barely contained psychic energy. Thousands of psykers were plugged into this machinery, their bodies suspended in nutrient tanks, their minds connected to cogitators and amplifiers that channeled their power into production on an unimaginable scale. They were manufacturing entire vehicles here, entire weapon systems, using the combined psychic might of these psykers to create from nothing the materiel the Imperium needed for its endless wars. I understood then what my reassignment meant. I would join them, would be suspended in one of those tanks, would spend whatever time remained to me, channeling my power through the machines until my body failed completely, and I died contributing my last measure of productivity to the Imperium's war effort. There would be no more cells, no more rest periods, no more individual existence. I would become part of a larger organism, a single cell in a vast body dedicated to production and nothing else. They processed me efficiently, stripped away my robes and shaved my head again, and fitted me with neural ports that connected directly to my brain. The technicians worked with the same emotionless precision I'd seen everywhere in the Imperium's facilities, treating my body as an object to be prepared for installation rather than a person to be cared for. I tried to feel something about this fear or anger or sorrow or anything, but found I couldn't. The capacity for strong emotion had been ground out of me over the decades, worn away like stone under falling water. The tank they placed me in was filled with fluid that burned my eyes and throat until my body adjusted, thick and viscous, and maintaining my body temperature at exactly 37 degrees. Tubes connected to my ports, to catheters they'd inserted, to nutrient feeds that would sustain me for however long I lasted. The machinery activated, and I felt my consciousness expand, felt myself becoming part of something larger, felt my power amplified and directed by the cogitators into specific channels of manifestation. There was no time here, no day or night, no cycles of work and rest. I existed in a continuous present, creating components endlessly, my mind functioning at levels I'd never achieved during individual production. The machines made me more efficient, more precise, squeezed every possible unit of productivity from my psychic potential. I was aware of the other psykers around me, felt their presence like distant lights in darkness, but we couldn't communicate, couldn't connect as individuals. We were nodes in a network, points of production in a vast manufacturing enterprise. I don't know how long I've been here. Months? Years? The fluid surrounding me has grown cloudy, I think. Or perhaps my eyes are failing. My body feels distant, feels like something I'm observing rather than inhabiting. The production continues, will continue, until my heart stops, or my brain dies, and then they'll extract my corpse and install another psyker in this tank, and the work will go on without interruption. Sometimes, in moments when the production demands are low and the machines allow my mind to drift slightly, I remember being Kale. I remember the hive where I was born, remember my sister's face when I showed her the food I'd created, Remember the simple joy I felt in that moment before everything changed. The memory is distant, faded, like something that happened to someone else in another lifetime. But it's there, buried deep in whatever remains of my original personality. I understand now what I've become, what the Imperium made of me. I'm no longer human in any meaningful sense, no longer a person with agency or desires or potential. I'm a resource, a component in a machine so vast I can barely comprehend its scale, a single cell in a body that spans galaxies and encompasses trillions of souls, all bent toward the same purpose: survival, continuation, the endless grinding war against extinction. The boy who made food appear in his hands wanted to help people, wanted to make his sister smile. The thing I've become does help people, I suppose, in its own way. The components I create become weapons that defend human worlds from Xeno's invasion, become armor that protects soldiers fighting in the Emperor's name, become systems that keep ships functioning as they carry humanity's warriors to distant battlefields. My existence serves the species, even if it destroys the individual. I don't know if that's enough, don't know if my suffering has meaning beyond its utility, don't know if the Imperium's vast machinery of exploitation and consumption is justified by the threats it protects against. But I know I can't stop, can't refuse, can't do anything except continue channeling my power into these machines until my body fails and they replace me with another Psyker who'll face the same fate. The fluid tastes like rust and ozone. It always has, since the moment they came for me in the hive, since the moment my life ended and my service began. That taste is the only constant, the only thread connecting the boy I was to the thing I've become. I hold on to it because it's all I have left, all that remains of the person who created food for his hungry sister and thought he was doing something good. The machines hum around me, demanding more production, more components, more output. My power flows through the neural connections into the cogitators, manifesting materials according to specifications I no longer consciously process. This is what I am now. This is what I'll be until I die. A weapon that manufactures weapons. A tool that creates tools. A resource to be exploited until exhaustion. The black ships are still out there, still collecting children who show the witch mark, still bringing them to facilities like the one where I trained. They'll learn control, or they'll die. They'll be sanctioned, or they'll be destroyed. They'll serve the Imperium in whatever capacity their powers demand. Will surrender their humanity piece by piece until nothing remains except utility and function. I want to tell them it's worth it. Want to believe that our sacrifice serves some greater purpose, that the species survives because of what we give up. But I don't know if that's true. Don't know if anything means anything beyond the immediate moment, beyond the endless cycle of production and consumption and war that defines human existence in this dark millennium. The fluid grows warmer, or perhaps I'm growing colder. My body is failing, I think, finally reaching the limits of what flesh can endure. The machines compensate, increase the nutrient flow, stimulate my organs to continue functioning beyond their natural limits. I'll burn out completely before they let me rest. Will give everything until there's nothing left to give. My sister would be old now, if she survived. Maybe she's dead, recycled back into corpse starch to feed another generation of hive dwellers. Maybe she had children who've already been conscripted into the guard, or taken by the manufactorums, or fallen into one of the countless other ways the Imperium consumes its citizens. Maybe she remembers me sometimes, wonders what happened to her brother who disappeared when she was young. I hope she doesn't. I hope she forgot me cleanly and completely, and never wasted a thought on the boy who made food appear and then vanished into the machinery of the Imperium. The production continues. Components materialize in the collection chambers, are transported away to assembly facilities I'll never see, are incorporated into weapons and vehicles and systems that serve purposes I don't understand. My contribution is infinitesimal in the context of the Imperium's vast industrial output, but it's also essential, because every component matters, every bolt and wire and system is necessary for the machinery of war to continue functioning. I'm proud of that, I think. Or perhaps I've simply been conditioned to feel pride, trained over decades to equate my value with my productivity. It doesn't matter, pride or conditioning, the result is the same. I serve, I produce, I contribute to humanity's survival in the only way someone like me can. The darkness is growing deeper, pressing in at the edges of my consciousness. My heart is stuttering, missing beats, struggling to continue pumping blood through my failing system. The machines detect this, make adjustments, but there are limits to what technology can compensate for. I'm dying, finally, after decades of service, after giving everything I had to give. I think about the Emperor, wonder if he knows I exist, if my sacrifice registers in his consciousness at all. Probably not. I'm one psyker among millions, one manufactorum worker among billions, one servant among the countless trillions who comprise his Imperium. My death will be noted in a logbook somewhere, filed away in records that stretch back 10,000 years, and then forgotten completely as my replacement takes over production tank 7,743 and continues the work. That's fine. That's how it should be. I'm not special. Never was special except for the curse of the witch mark that made me useful to the Imperium's purposes. I was always going to end here, or somewhere like here, always going to die feeding the vast machinery that keeps humanity alive in a hostile universe. My life had meaning only in its utility, only in what it could produce and contribute and sacrifice. The last thing I remember, before my heart stops completely and my consciousness fragments, is the taste in my mouth. Rust and ozone, metallic and sharp, the flavor that's followed me since the moment the Arbites came to take me away from my home. It's appropriate, I think, that this is what remains at the end. Not memories of family or joy or anything human, but simply the taste of service, the flavor of sacrifice, the constant reminder of what I was and what I became. The machines continue humming around me, will continue long after I'm gone. The fluid in my tank will be drained and recycled. My body will be processed into base materials, waste not permitted in the Imperium's efficient systems. Another psyker will be installed where I was, will take over my function, will burn themselves out over decades of service, before being replaced by yet another. The cycle continues, eternal and unchanging, the great wheel of the Imperium grinding forward over the bodies of its servants. This is what happens when the black ships take you. This is the fate that awaits those who carry the witch mark. We burn ourselves out in service to humanity, sacrifice everything we are and everything we might have been, become fuel for a machine that will forget us the moment we're consumed. And we do this willingly, or at least resignedly, because there is no alternative, no escape, no other purpose available to someone cursed with psychic power. I was Kale once. I made food appear for my sister. I thought I could be a hero. I am 7743 Psi Tertius. I manufactured components. I served the Imperium. I am nothing. I am ending. I am gone. The production continues without me, as it always has, as it always will. The Imperium endures. Humanity survives. The cost is irrelevant. The sacrifice is necessary. This is the way of things in the dark millennium, in the vast empire of mankind, where individual existence means nothing and service means everything. This is what I became. This is what you will become, if the black ships come for you. This is the grimdark truth of psychic service, the reality that hides behind the propaganda and the prayers and the promises of duty and honor. You will be broken and rebuilt and used and discarded, and the Imperium will roll forward without pause, without acknowledgement, without mercy. There is only war. There is only service. There is only the endless grinding consumption of souls in the name of humanity's survival. I gave everything. It was never enough. It was always necessary. The darkness takes me finally, completely, and I surrender to it with something that might be relief, or might simply be exhaustion. My last thought is of rust and ozone, of that first moment when my power manifested and my fate was sealed, of the taste that followed me through decades of service and stayed with me until the very end. And then, nothing. And then silence. And then the machines cycle down my tank and prepare for the next psyker, who'll take my place and continue the work that never ends, never changes, never stops. The great machine of the Imperium demands it. The Emperor's will requires it. Humanity's survival necessitates it. This is service. This is sacrifice. This is what becomes of those marked by the witch sign. This is the only fate we were ever going to have.